Good afternoon. I'm Richard Gigline, and on behalf of our panel today, I'd like to welcome you to our Compensation Committee webinar, Demystifying the Millennial, What Boards Need to Know About Leadership Development and Compensation. Who is a typical millennial in your company? Despite what many of us have been led to believe, there is no easy definition for this generation. However, there are strong cultural influences that have shaped this age group and have led to a new and very different approach to careers in the workplace. As boards and compensation committees are playing a more active role in leadership development and long-range succession planning, directors will soon be working more closely with this high-profile population if they aren't already. Today, my colleagues and I will explore what is myth and what is reality when it comes to developing and compensating this new generation of corporate leaders. I'm joined today by Catherine Allen, a current director on the board of Synovus Financial Corporation and El Paso Electric Company. Interesting, Kathy is also currently researching and writing a book on millennials. Also, Alap Shah, a managing director and executive compensation consultant in the New York office of Pearl Meyer. Before we begin the discussion, Ronell Perry with NACD Education Team has our housekeeping announcements. Ronell?
Thank you, Richard. Audience, please be aware that you can submit a live question and possibly receive your answer directly from Pearl Meyer today. Whatever questions we can't answer live, we'll answer via email. You can also tweet live with us today on our event by tweeting with @NACD and @Pearl Meyer. If you opt in to submit questions today, you'll also be receiving future executive compensation thought leadership from Pearl Meyer. The presentation and slides are available for download right within the console and at the link on the slide. For today's participation, you will receive one NACD skill credit, and your credit may be applied to your NACD fellowship. If you have questions, please see the email address on the slide. And remember, the replay and slides will be available early next week at nacdonline.org and pearlmeyer.com. Alap, over to you.
Thank you, Ronell. We have an exciting agenda for you today. And so today's presentation is going to cover some basics about the multi-generational workforce. Many of us have done or heard a good deal about the generational breakouts, but we thought we'd get started with getting a bit grounded as to what are the specific age demographic breakouts of each of the generations. Then we'll go through some myths about the new workforce, millennials as well as Gen Z. And then we'll close this out by talking a bit about how to manage the multi-generational workforce. Now, to start off, we thought we'd get our juices flowing and not really trying to be too Socratic about it, but we thought we would start off with a polling question. And does your compensation program currently align with your organization's generational demographics? Well, yes, no, or I don't know. Please submit your responses now. Now, Kathy and Richard, we all thought it would be a good idea to start off the program with this type of question. And, frankly, I'm not really sure what the answers are going to be if many organizations are currently and actively looking at this. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'll speak for my own boards that I'm on. We actually do talk about the demographic changes, in particular in the electric utility, where we have a number of boomers getting ready to retire or at retirement age, and then looking at how do we attract and retain enough Gen Xers and millennials to come into the various positions we have, whether they're lineman positions or electrical engineer positions. So we have looked at our compensation programs to align them with incentives for each of the age groups. And just as one example, to attract new millennials, in many cases we're offering to pay for their student loan debts if they promise to stay for a certain period of time.
So let's take a look at some of the results. Okay, Richard, are you surprised at all?
No, I'm really not. I think it really depends. Some of the things that Kathy alluded to, I think, for example, a utility company, I happen to have a large utility company client. They're dealing with the same issues of how to attract, how to engage people into their organization, especially into positions that are sort of front line. If you think in the context of a backhoe operator, how do you get a millennial to want to come and do that? Well, I think there's some very specific things that can happen, and this particular company is focusing on how do you get them engaged so they're going to want to do that basic job, but believe there is an opportunity to grow.
Right, and I think the results also, the large number of I don't know, I think also speaks to the point that the company is actually internally maybe working on this, but it needs to get to the level where the directors are actually also reviewing programs and understanding how compensation programs are going to shift.
And I think one last comment I'd make, I'd spent a number of years in the gaming industry, and they are just now really waking up, not from the standpoint so much of their employee base, but their customer base. What a huge impact this demographic shift is causing and will continue to cause as the boomers drop off and go off to the twilight zone, and they become the dominant population component.
That's an excellent point, Richard, because you really do have to think holistically about demographics and the impact not only on how you attract and retain and motivate your future employees, but also who they are as your stakeholders, your stockholders, your customers, your regulators, in fact, and if you're a regulated entity. So I think it's critically important that senior management and boards understand the rapidly changing demographics and the fact they're not alike, that each of these different segments are quite different from each other.
Right. Absolutely. And so speaking of that, let's start by getting a bit grounded in what these generational breakouts are. And Kathy, I'd like you to sort of, talk to this and also the seminal events that have affected, some of these populations. So Gen Z is essentially currently individuals who are 21 years old and under, so they're just entering the workforce. Millennials, about 22 to 38. Gen X, about 39 to 52. And baby boomers, about 53 to 71. So, Kathy, would you like to speak to some of these breakouts?
Sure. And just as examples on this, sometimes people tend to lump the millennials and the Gen Zs together, and marketers are just beginning to understand the actually consumer power, because 40% of consumers by 2020 will be these Gen Zs. They grew up, they're digital natives, they grew up with smartphones in their hand, they're the largest users of smartphones. The way that they shop is to go online and to get recommendations in social media from their friends. So it's a very different generation than, say, the millennials, who are also digitally or technologically savvy, but tend to be more actually mom and dad. They're very connected with their parents as opposed to the Gen Zs, who are more independent. And then you've got Gen Xers, who happen to be the smallest group in these age cohorts, and they're not very happy because not only are the millennials trying to take over their positions, many of the boomers are staying in their positions longer than age 65. They're not retiring as like other generations did, and so they're kind of caught in a squeeze. So understanding both the size of each of these age cohorts, and we're going to talk about a little bit later some of the distinguishing characteristics of them, is really important, and to understand the pressure on the Gen Xers, who are the people that are moving into leadership, if they're not already moving into leadership positions in these companies. So depending upon where you fall in the age cohort, you have a very different not only set of values and set of attitudes, but you also have numbers that are driving a lot of what is happening.
So, zeroing in on the millennials and Gen Z, what can you talk to some of these seminal events that have affected their sort of childhood and adulthood?
Right, and each generation has had seminal events, things that impact them or even that their parents impacted their parents. Like the boomers were impacted by the Depression, not because they themselves went through it, but from the learnings from their parents, and that carried through to them. But if you look at some of these, they're pretty awful events. I mean, they're massacres. The Columbine High School was the first time that you thought you were, safe in your high school, but it was the beginning of really publicized shootings in high schools. The wars, the fact that some of their contemporaries were going off to war, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan, and even though it's a volunteer army and Navy, it still impacted people they knew were going to war. The Enron and WorldCom implosions made them more skeptical about corporations and about even the future sustainability of a number of businesses. The Oklahoma City bombing was something that said, we have more terrorists internally to the United States than we do from the outside, and that you can't trust necessarily the people or even being in government buildings. Simpson trial, again, was led to skepticism, but 9/11, probably 9/11 and the financial crisis had the two largest impacts on these groups. The terrorist attacks in the sense of feeling vulnerable, feeling that they needed to have safety, and certainly their parents wanting to keep them safe. But the financial crisis, not only has it impacted the millennials' ability to find jobs or have good jobs, good paying jobs, but they also saw many of their parents lose their houses or lose jobs. And that had, an impact on their feelings about safety and security. It interestingly led the millennials to be very less oriented towards money and making money, and more about giving back or having experiences. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think it's important to look at each cohort and understand what has impacted them. The Gen Zs, again, the financial crisis has had a huge impact, but had the opposite way. For the Gen Zs, they are actually more savings and want to make money and are much more interested in compensation than the millennials are.
One add-on I'd make to that, to Kathy's remarks, is that it is further complicated by the fact that so many of the millennials particularly are really under a lot of financial stress because of their academic loans that they've taken out, and so they enter the workforce with big loan payments that they have to make.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely correct. And so, when you think about these seminal events, I mean, you think that these two generations, millennials and Gen Zs, are sort of, primed for success. I mean, they've had some of these sort of catastrophic events sort of happen in their lives. And so, on this page, we've highlighted a few individuals, and you can see that they've already, at such a young age, there's already some significant accomplishments. You have Caroline, who is the CEO of Computer Software, but, very well known as a tech influencer, and has been on the Rosetta Stone board for some time, and then recently got appointed to Morningstar's board. You have Aniket, who has been with Amnesty International for 15 years. Note the age of 28, but has been with Amnesty for about 15 years. Was on the board for many years, and then now has just in the past month been elected to be the chairman of Amnesty International's board. You have Holly, who started in venture capital, made a name for herself there, and when she went over to General Catalyst, which is another venture capital firm, it was named General Catalyst's first ever female managing director at the age of 31. And then finally, you have David, who made his name in sort of the private equity field and was named the CFO of Heinz. So what's interesting about these four individuals is that none of them were founders of the organizations that they are now leading or helping to lead. And so there's a recognition that's occurring that the millennial and soon and the Gen Zs as well will have have an ability to have a great amount of impact in amongst the executive ranks as well as on the board.
Yeah, I think all four of them are very interesting. The one that intrigues me a lot is David, CFO of Heinz, which has been around a very long time and is a very big corporation. 29 years of age at CFO. And then I think of the baby boomers as being probably still in some of the most senior positions, and how that works in terms of their communication skills and differences and how they engage with one another, I think is a fascinating thing to look at.
And that's a great point, especially being CFO, because again, within an organization, that's a very powerful position, and people listen to that CFO. But we also have a history of many of the millennials are the ones that have made it big. Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. We see a lot of the leaders in technology coming out of the millennial age group, and which has also led many of them to think they're entrepreneurs, but not necessarily, and we'll come back to that.
Right. No, absolutely correct. And there's some interesting stats about sort of level of entrepreneurship today versus decades ago. But I think looking at understanding that there are so many of this sort of younger cohort making it up very quickly into the executive ranks, and as part of the independent director population. I think this brings us to our next poll question, which is your company actively assessing policies and practices to accommodate the new workforce? Yes, we're re-examining our talent management process. Yes, we're re-examining our compensation programs. Yes, we're looking at both. No, we're actually not doing any of that, or I don't know. Now, when I think about this question, and when you think about sort of historical hierarchical type of organizations, I given the trajectory and the expectation level of both millennials as well as incoming Gen Z, I frankly think that if companies are not examining this now, they need to be on an annual basis, both the management team as well as the directors. Any additional comments there, Richard or Kevin?
What my comments are, they've just put up the answer slide. I'm surprised by one component on it, that a little bit more than half of our participants today say they are looking at both, and I'm surprised that it's that high. I really would have thought it was much less than that.
Well, I think that's great, though.
I do too.
Congratulations.
I think it's very good.
Whoever's on this webinar, you're in the know, because that is really.
As sitting directors, Kathy and Richard, let me ask you this: do you think, given that we're at 51% here, do you think that is coming from the board and asking management teams to look at this, or do you think this is internally, and management teams are seeing these these generational shifts and needing to manage this multi-generational workforce, and that they are starting the process?
Well, I've seen, again, I'll refer back to the boards. I'm also on a third board, which is not a public board, but it's a data analytics company in Seattle that is all millennials. In that company in particular, it came really from the workforce, from the employees. But in the other two, I would say the board probably pressed senior management to look at this as policies, and part of that comes out of the board, the role of a board. Part of it is most important, I think, is strategy, is helping to look at the outside and bring in those ideas into the company. And I think that's not only an important role, but I think it's something that the wisdom of board members should be to always be looking at these types of trends. So I would say in my other two, it was equal between the board saying, look, we need to look at this. And again, in the case of the utility, it was a talent management issue. How are we going to replace the retirees? And it took the board pressing management for them to actually look at their numbers and to say, oh my gosh, you're right. More than 2/3 of our workforce are reaching the retirement age or will in the next 10 years. And we need to really think about that, because sometimes they're so oriented on the day-to-day issues, looking at these demographic or talent management issues aren't as high priority. And one other point is I am seeing a number of boards start to talk. I'm on the NOM-Gov committee of all three of my boards. Our NOM-Gov committees are starting to talk about having a talent management person or that skill set in the matrix of when you're looking for new board members. So I think you're going to see more HR and talent management professionals being recruited to be on boards just because of the boards beginning to see how important it is that you manage your talent.
Yeah, one add-on to that, Kathy, I would say is that I think at least I'm seeing a whole lot more of the senior human resource executive level people, where the most senior HR person now is a direct report to the chief executive officer of the corporation, which not too long ago did not usually occur. The other add that I would put to this is that, again, a number of years in the gaming industry, the board of the company I was most recently on really started looking at this primarily because it was driven off of a change in their customer base. And once they really understood how much their customer base was changing, they said, oh my gosh, we need to pay attention to what we're doing with our employee base. That's how they got motivated.
Yeah. Right, and that makes a lot of sense, and that I think that's one of the sort of key takeaways is that you should be looking at is your customer base multi-generational, and what are the focus areas that, and should your employee base also reflect that in order to stay in tuned and aligned with the trends. Now we actually have a question from the audience that I think is interesting that I'll just put out there. Is that both of your poll questions have alluded to differing compensation programs by essentially age. How can you do that given laws and EEOC? And I think the idea here is not to have different compensation programs for different age groups, but to ensure that your compensation programs are flexible enough to accommodate the needs and wants and engagement points for the different generations that you're in charge of managing. And any additional insight or commentary on that, Kathy or Richard?
Well, I think compensation covers a much broader range than just simply saying how much are you paying for a given job category. It includes things, and Kathy alluded to it earlier, of helping pay for tuition debt that has been brought in with them and their new jobs. It includes giving them sabbatical time to pursue some other interest that they may have an intense involvement in, even though it's not their regular job. Those are all forms of how do you compensate people, not just with pure, how much per hour or per week or per month.
Right. And they do, excellent point, Richard, and it's also, you do have to make it available to all employees. You can't just say this age group gets their student debt repaid, but the other group doesn't. You make it available to all employees, but
yes,
it's geared towards the fact that most of the people who have student debt are the younger people that are coming in. Right. On the other hand, sabbaticals are something you make available to everyone in the workforce if they've been there a certain number of years, or you have the same consistent rules.
Right, and that's correct. It's about balance, ensuring that there's sort of enough components of the overall compensation program, engagement program, that balances the different needs of the multi-generational workforce. Like, you could definitely see that there may be some, Gen Xers or baby boomers that, will like to have more flexible time in case they have some, caretaking responsibilities that they're doing, things like that. So I think it's making enough things available, but with the knowledge that that certain segments of the population are going to be more focused on certain elements of that program than others.
Right.
So wanted to sort of shift to zeroing in on a little bit on the differences between the millennials and Gen Z, because I think this is actually quite interesting, and some of the differences here, frankly, surprised me. As a sort of Gen Z population is entering the workforce. But when you think about it in a certain context, I guess it's not fully surprising, because you have a good portion of millennials actually have been raised by boomers, and a good portion of Gen Zs have actually been raised by Gen Xers. So when you think about the sort of the profile of boomers and Xers, maybe some of these things aren't so particularly surprising. So I'll just highlight a few. Kathy, you alluded to this earlier, where Gen Z is definitely more focused on compensation and job security. This is really from being a product of the financial crisis. And whereas the millennials are definitely more focused on making sure that there's appropriate development opportunities within the organization and the appropriate level of coaches and access to that. The other thing I'll point out here is that if you're an organization that's still doing annual performance assessments, it's essentially going to be check the box for any millennial or Gen Z that is subject to those annual performance reviews. Both of these populations really want performance assessments and reviews to happen in real time with concrete feedback and suggestions. Gen Z seems to be, based on the data, a bit more interested in understanding the tools of what it takes to win. So they don't mind talking about their weaknesses and or strengths, whereas the millennials really want to focus more on their strengths and maybe not so much talk about their weaknesses. And then the last thing, which I find the most fascinating and interesting about your commentary here, Kathy and Richard, is that collaboration amongst the Gen Z is not as important. They tend to be very sort of a competitive mindset and want to work individually and very independently, similar to what I would say Gen Xers are. And to me, I'm just surprised to see that this whole collaboration idea is not being passed to the next generation.
And I wonder, when you think of the Gen Z being 21 years of age, just coming into really the work cycle, if what we know about them and see about them right now, I suspect that is going to evolve and change substantially over the next handful of years.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, is that when they actually enter in sort of a work environment where it's been built on collaboration, will they be more agreeable to it?
Well, and I just, thinking back in ancient history when I was 21, there were a whole lot of things that I didn't know or thought I knew that were wrong. And it didn't take very many years for me to start evolving and changing in pretty dramatic ways. I suspect some of that will happen with these people.
Yeah, and many of the Gen Zs are actually interested, goes back to job security, in working for larger companies that have a longer time span rather than going into the more entrepreneurial startups. So where the millennials were the ones that were more interested in going into the startups. And part of that was because they have had the backing of their parents. Something like a third of the millennials still live at home. And so part of that has allowed them to do more entrepreneurial things.
I think one other comment on the millennials, at least that I've had as an experience, is that almost every one of them that I've interfaced with, and it's quite a few, in addition to what they do for a living, they're very often involved in some sort of nonprofit community activity where they're giving back, where they're trying to support other components of the community in which they live.
I agree. It's one of the things that gives me hope is these millennials, because they do give back. They are conscious of the environment. They're conscious of they're more inclusive. They are conscious of people in need. They're minimalist in many ways. They're the shared economy. From Airbnb to Uber, all started because of the millennials believing that you don't need to have that much stuff and you need to help other people.
Right. And so now that we have a good understanding of sort of the different profiles of this new workforce, I think it would be a good idea to talk to how that actually translates into the workplace in terms of assets and liabilities. Like what are the sort of the good things about these profiles, and what are some of the bad things? So Richard, I think you had a story you wanted to share.
Well, is that the one on the utilities?
Yeah, the one on the utilities.
Yeah, my utility client is really addressing this whole issue of the millennials and how do you, one, attract them to come into your business, and then what in the world do you do with them to make sure once they're there that they are engaged and are retained. And the example that the CEO of this particular company gave me, a real-life example for him, this particular utility company has a lot of people who are, in fact, brought in to learn and to operate backhoes because they do a lot of land movement stuff. And they're finding a real challenge in getting people to want to come in and do that sort of ho-hum, mundane, routine kind of thing. How do you make that attractive? And they've done it by highlighting what that business is all about. What its focus is all about is environmental enhancements and protection and things of that nature in support of the community in which they are involved, and to also put in place programs and processes where that young backhoe operator can actually safely give his opinion about how we could do this different, how we could do it better, etc. And then finally, by giving them opportunities to raise their hand to say, I'm doing this job right now, I'm going to really keep doing it, I'm going to do it really well, but I'd like to be able to learn how to be a supervisor. And they offer free classes in supervision for anybody who's been with their company for a year or longer and has a clean record. And there's no guarantees they're going to get that job. But they volunteer to go into a supervisory class. They don't get compensated for it. They're not required to do it. But it's a way to really engage them.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to that sort of desire for development and personal development as well as career development. So I think that probably would be a very effective program. Now, Kathy, any stories to share on this sort of balance sheet of assets and liabilities?
Right, and they have many assets. I mean, there's lots of things that are great about this age group, but one of the I think hardest issues, and this speaks to their being technology savvy or technology driven, is this lack of skills in dealing with difficult people or situations. In fact, they don't generally have good conflict resolution skills. And I've heard from a number of HR people in like the big four accounting firms or others where they've actually had to train millennials as they come into the workforce in how to handle, either a disruptive person or a disgruntled employee or even a situation where it's difficult. Because when you are just relying on technology and you're emailing or texting someone, it's not the same as being in a one-on-one situation where you need to look that person in the eye and address whatever their needs are. And I told you guys the story the other day, but I was so amused by this, where we had a panel in New York on managing the multi-generational workforce. We had a millennial who gets paid by corporations to help them understand millennials and, track them and so forth. And he kept talking about himself being a super connector. And finally I asked him, what do you mean by a super connector? And he looked at me very serious and said, well, it's not all about LinkedIn or Facebook. He said, I go to conferences and talk to people, and I go to lunch. And I try to keep a straight face from doing this, thinking, oh my God. But basically, he was saying something about and kind of a sad thing about the millennials, for the most part, not really understanding how important human interaction is, and sometimes it's not always pleasant. And learning how to deal with that is a critically important skill set that sometimes the millennials who've been too dependent on technology are not able to do.
I had one experience several years ago that really brought that home to me in a really not very pleasant way. I was the CEO of this particular company. I had sent an email to the president and chief operating officer. I thought it was a very bland, non-confrontational email. My HR executive came in and said, did you read that email? I said, yeah, well, of course I wrote it. She said, but did you read it? Because the guy you sent it to is going to be really, really unhappy. I walked down the hall, and it was true. What he thought I had said in that email was so far from what I thought I had written that it was just beyond my being able to comprehend. I never forgot it, and I think about it a lot with the millennials because of what Kathy just said. They're so used to communicating through text messages and through their technology stuff versus eyeball to eyeball, being able to see somebody's physical reaction, etc.
Right. I think I think in our age of texting, we could all probably use a refresher course on interpersonal interaction.
I'm not going to pursue that any deeper than that.
Yeah. And so, what we probably wanted to do is, I think we had a sort of good dialogue on what are some of these assets and liabilities, and I think what would be a good thing to do is focus a little bit on some of the, the common myths that we hear in the media, amongst, in just talking to ourselves as the different generations think about this new workforce. The first being, job hoppers. And what we understand from this population really is that they don't need to necessarily hop from job to job to get their opportunities, but they will do so if their expectations are not met. And the implication of that is that no longer is the new workforce really attracted by name recognition, but really their focus is on having a quality experience. And so when you think about your compensation program associated with that, is that I think having band structures and compensation bands is still a fine thing to do, because you obviously need some sort of level of organization. However, it should focus more on the shadows and actually exist in more of the shadows, and there should be flexibility within those bands to allow for more outliers. Another myth that is there in terms of of this new workforce is that they want to work less. This is the whole work-life balance issue, to allow themselves to have more time for nonprofit activities or side hustles, if you will. And the fact of the matter is, this new workforce actually works more than prior generations, especially if you include all the hours they're devoted to their professional development. So I think the idea is to continue this trend that we have for flexible work schedules and work at home initiatives, but it's very important to communicate to this population that these types of flex schedules won't hamper their career progression. And reward systems should really be focused on results and not necessarily the face time or number of hours that you've put in. And you know, a way to sort of a strategic way to go about doing that is really focusing your compensation programs on more individual assessment of performance. So there's been this trend to focus very much on corporate metrics or divisional metrics within an organization, but I think there needs to be more of a balance and have some more individual performance orientation. Because if, you know, as you'll recall, the bonus pool will always be funded by corporate metrics, but you can have a more of a relationship of how they're actually, you know, performing if you implement some individual assessment in there.
One example I can give you on that a lot that I think is interesting. A young lady, a millennial, that's a very good friend of my wife and mine, is performing really, really well in a tech company that she's been with for a little over a year. And she let her supervisor know that she was also, in a prior life, a professional dancer, and that she was really missing the opportunity to keep that skill set live and real. And they told her and really suggested to her that she find a place where she could go and take those kinds of classes, dance classes, to keep that part of her life alive, and that they would let her do that in a sense like almost like a sabbatical. So she really could do it in the middle of a work day because that's the only time the classes are given, and continue to do her regular job.
Right, and I think we find a lot of, you know, organizations sort of, you know, being a bit more flexible and understanding those types of desires in order to continue to engage their workforce. So I'm going to, you know, flip through the next myth, you know, fairly quickly, which is don't respond to authority. I just think that's, you know, utterly false. I think it's not necessarily they don't like hierarchy or don't respond to authority. It's just they don't want to be hampered by it. They don't want to be limited by it. And you know, what really resonates is creating a very a learning-oriented environment where they can be part of multi-generational and multi-level teams, and where their contributions are really at the outset, you know, just respected. They come to the workforce with a significant knowledge base, and they want that to be recognized. The last one I think I should want to, you know, touch on a little bit, and Captain, maybe you want to speak to this, is this desire, this myth that they want to be entrepreneurs. And you know, here, you know, just a couple of stats to, you know, to ground this there is that the share of people under 30 who own businesses has fallen by 65% since the 1980s, and is now at a quarter-century low. More than 40% of 25 to 34-year-old Americans said a fear of failure kept them from starting a company in 2014. In 2001, that was just 24%. But yeah, you want to sort of speak to, you know, this sort of, you know, that they all want to be entrepreneurs type of myth?
Right. Because what happens is, and again, this is why it's important to look at what happened to this age group, whether it was the financial crisis or even 9/11, is it made them feel more insecure, and they actually are not as big risk takers as they would either like to be or think that they are. Now, the model is, again, as I said, many of the millennials are leading the tech companies today and are billionaires by the value that they've created in their companies. But those are far and few, you know, behind. And so the millennials, in some ways, they want to be entrepreneurs or they want to be entrepreneurial, but they still are living at home. They're not taking the risks to you know, put all of their lifestyle at risk to set up a company, which is what most entrepreneurs have to do. And in many cases, again, they don't want to work the hours an entrepreneur has to work to really make a success of the company. So I think that millennials, that's going to be one of the conflict things they themselves are going to have to deal with, because they don't like structure, but yet they need structure and need advice. They don't want authority in some ways, but they want coaching all the time. And they want to be entrepreneurial, but yet they don't want to take risks. And I think that it's going to be interesting how they change more structured corporations to be more entrepreneurial, which I think is a good thing, but yet to still provide them the safety and the risk aversion, by having a steady paycheck or having benefits or whatever it might be. They still want to create things. They want to be acknowledged for creating things, but the traditional entrepreneur of the past, or even small business owner, had to take enormous risks, maybe take all of their money and their family's money to put together to make a business work. They had to work, 90-hour weeks, and the millennials are having trouble with that because they also want this work-life balance, and they will have time to see their kids play soccer and, take a vacation or whatever. So I think that's going to be a continual challenge for them to reconcile those two sides to their thinking.
But I think there's an opportunity there for corporations. I mean, if you can, internally within the organization, if you can create this culture of innovation where it's okay to fail and be sort of this, entrepreneur, I think you get I think you increase the engagement potential dramatically. And so, ways to do that is to, maybe upend your performance management system and focus and have a matrix which focuses on the results an individual achieves as well as their potential. And, add these more milestone-based metrics because, there is this desire for security, but there's also this sort of competing like entrepreneurial spirit and sort of, desire to create. So, I think organizations have this ability to sort of, step in and say, you know what, come within our organization, and we'll give you that security but that sort of, ability to create and fail, and we won't penalize you for it.
And I think part of the way that's done in setting up a culture that, in fact, people know when they are coming to a meeting that they are free and do not have to be afraid to say whatever is on their mind, to bring whatever crazy idea to that meeting they have, that they're not going to be denigrated, they're not going to get thrown under the bus, and that failure is okay if you use it as an opportunity to also learn. There are a lot of techie companies that I think do that kind of thing where, they really look for all sorts of out-of-the-box thinking and then use those that they execute where they fail as a chance to really have an open dialogue and to learn and grow from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now this brings us to our last poll question. Has your board discussed or had an expert present on the changing demographics of boomers retiring, millennials becoming the largest workforce, and the implications of both in a board meeting or strategy session? Yes or no? I mean, I think, given the response we had on the last question, which was about 51%, saying that they are working on this, you can see the results. 72% actually saying, no, they're not, that there isn't much sort of expert guidance that is being, presented. And I think that's, fascinating, is that I think it'd be worthwhile for companies to maybe engage some experts in understanding the implications of this and really focus less on doing things on a sort of a feel or gut basis and try to manage this multi-generational workforce more effectively.
I really agree with that. I think that there is a real need for having a much clearer understanding of what all the different differentiating points are of each of these generational components. And I think there's not much time spent about thinking about how that is different and what the impact of those differences are. If you don't understand what they are, you're not going to do anything about it.
Right. We've tried again, in one of my boards, we've had a speaker come in and talk to it from a marketing point of view, and then in the comp committee actually have some expertise around it from a compensation point of view. But I really think boards should look at having demographers or experts in this area to come in and really help them to rethink. And it's not just age. I mean, we're talking today about age cohorts, but you look at, I believe it's by 2020, 30% of the population will be Hispanic or Latino background. It might be 2030. Right. And that's a huge, both from a marketing and a management and a attraction point of view, is a really important market for us to understand. And again, sometimes the boards bring this to senior management, sometimes it's senior management bringing it to the boards, but both parties should be attending, learning about this, reading about this. I tell everybody, I read this when I used to teach in a graduate business school. I used, in the 80s, Landon Jones' Great Expectations. And he's a demographer, and he wrote about the baby boomers. And had I paid attention to what I was reading, I would be a wealthy person today, because he laid out, just from both life events and demography, what would happen at each stage in the boomers' lives. And, he was been absolutely right on. And that's what actually made me interested in writing about the millennials, because I think the millennials and the Gen Zs are going to be two different cohorts and act differently, but they're our next big consumers, and what they're going to do is going to change many things in the world, from politics to public policy to how corporations are run to the environment. And again, I think of it as a more optimistic. I'm very optimistic about both of those age cohorts. But we need to understand it I'm a boomer, and we need to understand it to best set up the governing bodies to help those cohorts do the best that they can do.
And I think what makes that even more critical to what you've said, Kathy, is when you look at the demographic profiles and the numeric aspect of it. Those two generations are gigantic in terms of numbers. They're not just sort of going to be here. They're really going to be here.
Right, but I would caution against sort of that we shouldn't overly focus on what is the new workforce, because what we have in reality is that people are working longer, and what we have in reality is that we need to be able to manage a sort of generational workforce. So I think having sort of that expertise come into the boardroom or sit down with the senior management team and talking through those sort of demographics and the implications of having the demographics would be very important to do, but it should focus on, what is still good, what should we be doing for the boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, and the and these Gen Zers, and figure out what are first the commonalities of these different generations, and how could we sort of supplement our sort of compensation programs, not just pay but other things as well as our talent management process to account for all these generations. Any sort of real life experiences to share with Richard?
Let me just make one comment to what you just said, Alap. I think this is such an incredibly positive time, opportunity-wise. The multi-generational, this whole thing about the millennials and Gen Zs, and the fact that we are spending so much time and attention on it, what we're talking about doing to engage them, to get them excited, to want them to stay within our organizations, it will also be a wonderfully impactful, positive thing on the other generations that are there, in my view. I believe that the Gen X people will find a lot of this as being really, really good for them, because they're so used to growing up in traditional organizations of command and control and my way or the highway, and suddenly they're going to be seeing that the culture is trying to shift and be built so that you really are expected to stand up, to say what you think, to do it respectfully, and to not be afraid. And that's a big difference for a lot of those people.
I totally agree with you, Richard, and I think there's lots of opportunities. Just one very short story. One of the boards I'm on, this Analytics Pros, was actually a company started by millennials when they were 24 years old, and it's been very successful, but they reached they're entrepreneurs, and they realized they didn't have the experience of a corporate life, of how to run a financial or the finances, or how to do HR, or how to even set up a structured sales force. And they brought in a boomer who was retiring from another corporation. She was 58 and saying, I'm not ready to retire, but, corporations will think I'm too old. And the millennials were saying, we don't know how to run this. We've got it as far as we can. So now she is the CEO, and she's part mentor, part CEO, part mom sometimes, and the employees are all millennials, and she's done a fabulous job. But it's a good example. I think you're going to see more marrying of boomers who have the wisdom and experience with some of these wonderful millennials and Gen Zs who have ideas but haven't had that experience. And there's a respect between the millennials and the boomers about that experience and how to grow their company. And so AP has really taken off because our CEO was able to, overlay these great ideas, great technology, great, relationships with structure that needed to be there to grow a business.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great example.
And so, I think our time has already run out, so and unfortunately we won't have any time for questions, but we will answer all questions that were posted via email. But just a few, key takeaways I wanted to hit on is that I think in this multi-generational workforce, I think companies should, to increase engagement amongst them, I think all companies should start looking at, more enhanced benefits. Tuition reimbursement, 100% healthcare coverage, life convenience, in case you have some caretaking responsibilities or simply just want to, drop off your dry cleaning somewhere. Something to also look at is more frequent bonus payouts to really get that performance and pay feedback loop going, semi-annual or quarterly. Enhanced use of recognition awards. This is the whole old spot bonus concept, but maybe turn that into high potential compensation pools. We've done a lot of designing of that as of late for our clients. And really sort of heightening this, going to pay for performance 2.0. And what I mean by that is focusing on both results as well as potential. And I think, looking at the workforce in those and adding these sort of supplementary things to your compensation program will sort of help you manage that multi-generational workforce, a lot better.